Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to my complete and detailed Durin guide. Durin is the newest Pyro 5-star character released in the latest version, Luna 3, also known as 6.2, and he's a very versatile and strong sub-DPS, support, and also damage dealing character. And so today we're going to cover everything you need to know about Durin. We're going to talk about his best builds, weapons, artifacts, teams, constellations, different playstyles, and so much more, all in one video. Before we begin, I want you guys to know that I do stream most nights on Twitch, link in the description if you're interested, and also I get to give you guys this information a bit earlier than it otherwise would have been, because I got to play Durin before he came out on the creator experience server. With that said, all the footage you're seeing in this video is going to be from the live server, as I kind of had to test a lot of things once he was out and make sure that this guide was as exhaustive as I wanted it to be. I'll try to be a bit earlier for future characters like Columbina. I hope the wait was worth it, and with that said, let's now talk about Durin. Alright, so starting things off, what does Durin actually do? Firstly, what you need to know is that Durin is a character who has two different modes, the white mode and the dark mode. While Durin starts at a baseline in his white mode, you can choose which to enter after using your elemental skill. In fact, after using Durin's elemental skill, you could then do one of two things, either pressing it again, using your skill a second time to do some AoE pyro damage and enter the white mode, or do a normal attack instead, which will unleash a slash of 3 pyro hits in front of him, and then he will enter the dark mode instead. Outside of that, the skill will also generate particles, but also regen some energy for your Durin, 30 at talent level 9 or 33 at talent level 10, which is a big deal, but more on that later. More importantly though, which mode Durin is in will change his playstyle completely. In fact, if you are in white mode, Durin's elemental burst will manifest the power of the Dragon of White Flame, and while the initial hit of the burst will deal a bit of AoE pyro damage, what is more important is the continuous off-field AoE pyro application. This is a burst that will last for 20 seconds with an 18-second cooldown, meaning that it has over 100% uptime, and in the white mode, it will deal damage once per second, and applying pyro every second hit to the same enemy, but hitting every second for 20 seconds is a really big and consistent amount of off-field pyro damage and also pyro application. Now, in the dark mode, while you will still be doing off-field pyro damage, these hits will actually be single target instead of AoE, and they will also have a bit of a higher scaling. They will do a bit more damage, but they will attack slower at a rate of once every 1.25 seconds instead. I also wanted to mention somewhere that Durin's burst does not snapshot, which means that your stats are going to be factored in kind of as they are for every hit. So if you use your burst inside of Bed Assault and then swap out, well, you won't keep the attack buff that you had for the whole burst. With that said, the main difference between dark and light mode actually comes from Durin's first passive. In fact, inside of white mode, Durin will shred resistances when you trigger any pyro related reaction other than vaporize or melt, so namely overload, pyro swirl, pyro crystallize, or burning, and this does include dealing pyro or dendro damage to an opponent that's already burning, so reapplying it, which helps for consistency. Now, as you trigger these reactions, Durin will not only reduce the pyro resistance of enemies, but also whatever other element was involved in the reaction, with the res shred being a baseline of 20%, but it can actually be higher through another passive that we are about to get into. Before we do, however, regarding vaporize and melt, the reactions that will not benefit from this res shred, well, that's where Durin's dark mode comes in. In fact, when Durin is inside of the dark mode, after using his burst, he will instead gain increased damage to his vaporize and melt reactions, being 40% at a baseline. What this means is that in white mode, Durin will shred resistances to pyro and other elements, increasing his overall team's damage, himself included, because pyro res shred also benefits him. In this case, he acts as a support and sub DPS, whereas inside of the dark mode, he acts more as a carry. He will not offer you any resistance shred, but he will instead increase his own reaction, damage to vaporize and melt, which gives him two distinct ways of being played. Now, if that wasn't enough, this passive's effects get increased by 75% if he is paired with another Hexerei character, meaning that you have the Hexerei resonance. Now, a lot of these characters do have really good synergy with Durin. Some are even 4 stars, like very notably Fischl, that we'll talk about a lot throughout the video, but a lot of these Hexerei characters, and potentially even future ones that aren't out yet, such as Varka, Alice, Nicole, and who knows who else, either already do or may potentially synergize with Durin, which means that getting this effect is going to be very easy in a lot of his teams. As we will see in the team comp section later, having a second Hexerei character for Durin is not a must, because Durin has so many teams where he can be good, but it will be present in the majority of his strongest teams. Now, with this 75% increase, this means that your res shred will go from 20% to 35% inside of the white mode, and your personal vape and melt damage inside of the dark mode will go from 40% to 70% instead. Outside of that, Durin also has another passive that will increase the damage of his burst up to 10 times. He'll gain 10 stacks of something called Primordial Fusion, and each hit will consume 1, which will increase the damage dealt by 3% of the original damage for every 100 attack he has. This means that if Durin has 2500 effective total attack, and this factors in any buffs you're getting through supportive artifact sets or supportive characters, Durin will gain a 75% damage increase for 10 hits of his elemental burst. And I also want to clarify that the way this is worded means that this isn't just damage bonus, but it's actually actually an increase to your multipliers, an increase to your motion value, which makes it a pretty big deal. This doesn't mean that attack will be necessarily better than crit, but it does make it a more useful stat, at least up until you have 2500 effective attack, where getting it on your artifacts increases not only this passive talent, but also your base kit does scale with attack too, so you're kind of double dipping in that regard. For those reasons, attack up till 2500 when you factor in all of your team buffs is going to be even more valuable than usual, but more on that when we cover Durin's artifacts a bit later in the video. Lastly, for Durin's talent priority, you should maximize his elemental burst and then his elemental skill, as leveling his burst will give you the most damage, and leveling his skill also matters to, yes, do a bit of damage, but also increase how much energy you're getting back, which is quite nice. Lastly, you can ignore your normal attacks unless you plan on playing Durin as an on-field carry, most notably with a C6 Bennett where your attacks become pyro, in which case you can also level them. For an off-field support or sub DPS though, you can just level your burst and your skill. And so to recap Durin's kit and talk about his different playstyles, this is what you need to know to keep things simple. Durin can either be in the white mode or in the dark mode. Instead of the white mode, he's a off-field support, sub DPS, and also a strong damage dealer who will continuously apply pyro for you, have good off-field pyro damage, and will also decrease the resistance of both pyro and also any element involved in a pyro-related reaction outside of hydro and cryo for vaporize and melt. For those two reactions, Durin has dark mode, where he will increase his own personal damage to both vaporize and melt instead of giving your team res shred. He also has great synergy with the Hexerei units, but more on that in the team section later. Outside of just that, Durin can also be played as an on-field DPS, most notably with C6 Bennett that infuses his normal and charge attacks with pyro, where you can play him either in dark mode or white mode, depending on if you're playing him in, for example, a vaporize team or an overload one. Additionally, even if you don't have C6 Bennett, Durin can be on-fielded in teams where there isn't an actual main DPS in order to benefit from the buffs of, say, Bennett's Circle or the Marie-José Hunter set with Farina that only works if you are on field. So there is a case for that, although it is less common. And in the vast majority of his teams, he will just be an off-field burst support and sub DPS, who, as I already said, gives you great damage and pyro application, as well as either more vapor melt damage in the dark mode or res shred for himself and your team in the white mode. As for the way you actually want to play Durin, it's very straightforward. Using your skill twice and then your burst will make you enter white mode, and using your skill then a normal attack and then your burst will make you enter dark mode instead. Now, I do want to mention a few things. Number one, if your energy is full, note that Durin defaults to white mode starting out, like when you load into an abyss chamber, for example. So if you want to play Durin in white mode and don't want to overflow on your full energy, you can use your burst before your skill, or press your skill once, then burst, and then use the second cast of your skill in order to get the energy refund from using your second skill, which is when you get the energy back, and not actually wasting it. While this is only a tip for white mode because you start inside of it, so you don't actually have to skill before bursting, for dark mode, it won't work for your first rotation, but do note that you stay inside of your form for 30 seconds after your skill cast, meaning that for future rotations, you can use your burst whenever it comes up, provided it's within 30 seconds of your last skill cast. So it's okay if the second time you swap into Durin, you burst if you're ready in dark mode, and then use your skill after for the energy. And in his on-field playstyle, you'll oftentimes be spamming a normal attack into a charge attack to maximize his damage, pyro application, and to line up your reactions. Last, I want to mention that if you're spamming N1Cs on Durin doing his charge attacks, you can dash or jump cancel them, although I'd be careful with dash canceling because it costs a lot of stamina, so you'll run out quickly, but you can jump cancel them for faster charge attacks. Now, I also wanted to re-emphasize that Durin's gameplay and kind of rotation is extremely straightforward. Just make sure you're using his burst in the right form and also doing it generally pretty early on in order to actually apply pyro, and especially as a support, make sure to use his burst before going into your main carry to actually get the pyro and the res shred ready and in motion before you do your DPS rotation on whoever your main DPS is. Lastly, if you want my thoughts on Durin as a character, do check out my last video where I gave a detailed review of my thoughts on Durin and his different teams. As a recap, I'll just say that he's very versatile and a super strong pyro sub DPS support and even damage dealer, and it has especially great synergy with the Hexerei units, but obviously don't feel forced to get him as he doesn't break the game. He's not a must pull, but if you're looking for a form of off-field pyro, Durin is a great choice. And lastly, before we get into the build section, I want to say that because Durin has a lot of different kind of modes like white mode, dark mode, and can even be on field, I will make sure to cover all of his different builds and what he's looking for each playstyle in the coming sections. With that in mind, he oftentimes will need similar stats, want similar artifacts and weapons and stuff like that, with there just being some slight variance. So for the most part, the builds will be pretty similar, but I will emphasize when a certain artifact set or a certain weapon is better for a certain type of playstyle. All right, now with all that out of the way, let's talk about how to actually build your Durin, starting with the artifact sets. Now, the first thing I want to do is actually highlight the fact that Durin as a Hexerei character doesn't have a dedicated set for him. And because we know that future Hexerei units such as Varka, Alice, and Nicole are probably going to be playable characters, it is highly likely that a future artifact set that synergizes with with Hexerei characters, or at least with Durin, does come out and becomes his new set that you should farm for. While this is unknown, the reason I'm bringing this up is because as of right now, while Durin does have a few sets he can go, none are tailor-made for him, and so it does seem like there's a chance that he gets a future set more designed for him. If that's the case, obviously you should farm it, but as of right now, for his artifact sets, here's what you should know. Generally, as a support or sub DPS, Noblesse Oblige will be your standard option if no other support in your team is running Noblesse Oblige, and also if you're running at least one other attack scaling damage dealer alongside Durin. This is because the 2-piece will give you 20% burst damage, which is already good, and then the 4-piece will increase all of your party members' attack by 20% for 12 seconds after you burst on Durin. Now, while this won't have a 100% uptime because Durin's burst cooldown is 18 seconds, the burst damage and attack buff to Durin himself but also other party members makes it a really strong option and your general best in slot with attack scaling characters. Outside of just buffing your team, it's also pretty comparable in terms of personal damage with Durin's other options because of the fact that there just isn't that much that's great. In fact, outside of Noblesse Oblige, so if someone else is already running it, or if you can't make the most out of the attack buff, then there are a few options like either some of the 4-piece sets we'll talk about, or even just mix and matching 2-piece sets based on what you have the better substats of. In fact, you can mix and match 2-piece sets of anything that gives you useful stats, such as 2-piece Noblesse Oblige with 2-piece Crimson Witch of Flames for burst damage and pyro damage, or even any of the 2% attack percent sets, because attack percent is very useful for Durin, so all of these will be strong options based on your substats. Similarly, you can also run Emblem of Severed Fate, and even though, as we'll see in the very next section, Durin does not need a lot of energy recharge, even just through the 20% you get from this 2-piece and save 5 to 10% on your substats, you will already get upwards of 30 to 35% burst damage from the 4-piece, even without looking for energy recharge. For those reasons, while you definitely shouldn't build more ER than you need, the fact that you get some burst damage for free on the 4-piece makes it viable if you just have good emblem pieces lying around on your account, and it will perform pretty similarly to a 2-piece, sometimes being slightly better or slightly worse, depending on many factors. Outside of that, if you are triggering reactions on Durin, like most notably Vaporize, then Crimson Witch of Flames or Gilded Dreams can both be viable artifact sets. And while you won't have great uptime on the stacks, it's still some damage bonus, which is useful, and Gilded Dreams gives you a ton of EM and also some attack if you have another Pyro party member, so pretty good stats overall. Gilded Dreams is great as an off-field dark mode Durin for Vape or Melt teams, being just a solid option, but also being even better if you're playing a Burgeon Durin, and actually in this more niche but still strong Burgeon playstyle, Flop can be the best for your Burgeon damage, whereas Gilded Dreams can be better if you're also overloading and vaporizing, so it'll depend on your team and substats. Outside of that, for the only real strong artifact set Durin can actually run, this is going to be Maréchaussée Hunter, provided your Durin is an on-field main DPS who's being ran alongside Furina and a healer. If you have all of these conditions, then Durin can gain 36% crit rate from this set effect, making it his best option overall when paired with Furina. This makes teams with Furina and a healer much more viable, as we'll talk about in the team section, so if you do plan on playing Durin as a on-field DPS with Furina and a healer, definitely run Maréchaussée Hunter. Outside of that, for some even more niche options, because Durin can run so many, thanks to the lack of his specific kind of must-run artifact set, in certain teams, specific supportive sets can be usable. For example, Deepwood Memories in a Dendro team, notably with Kniech, although keep in mind that there oftentimes will be another supportive character who does less damage that can run the Deepwood Memories set instead, so you don't need to run it on Durin, and you oftentimes won't, but it can be a viable and sometimes optimal artifact set under certain conditions. Similar things can also be said with other supportive sets like Petra with Geo characters where you pick up the crystal on Durin, Scroll or even Silken Moon in Ascendant Gleam, but these are more niche and rarely recommended. Lastly, I wanted to mention that in a Burning team, Unfinished Reverie can be okay on Durin, but for the most part, I feel like this section should not be this complicated. As a brief summary, for Durin's standard playstyle as a sub DPS and support, Noblesse Oblige will be your go-to unless it's already on someone else, in which case mix and matching 2-piece sets or going for any of the other generic solid 4-pieces will all work relatively similarly depending on your substats, so there really is a lot to choose from, and you can keep things simple. Once again though, it is highly likely that a future set for Durin and or Hexerei characters does come out, so I would hold off on farming something new, as that could very likely be his future best in slot option. Alright, now next up for the stats you're looking for on Durin, here's what you need to know. Firstly, Durin as a sub DPS or even carry is someone who generally does not need a lot of energy recharge. This is because his elemental skill will not only generate 4 pyro particles, but will also refund energy to him of an amount that scales with your talent level. At talent level 9, this is 30 energy, which is a lot, and it makes it to where in a lot of Durin's more meta or I guess popular teams, most notably in overload teams or with other pyro characters, Durin can oftentimes need no energy recharge at all. However, in some other teams, more notably as the solo pyro off-field option, Durin can end up needing a bit of energy recharge in order to actually get his burst up on cooldown. While this depends heavily on the team, to give you guys some rough ranges, I'll put them on screen now, where Durin can need virtually no energy recharge in these overload or teams with pyro teammates, around 130 or 140 in teams that may have a pyro teammate like Bennett but low overall particle generation, or a bit higher than that if he's the solo pyro option. Now keep in mind the exact ER you need will vary heavily based on so many factors, like how much energy your team generates if you have a character like Fischl, other pyro characters, Favonius weapons, how many times you're using Durin's skill, because if you use it twice you need no ER at all, and these overload teams as mentioned also need none. But in some other teams, because he's so versatile as the solo pyro option from off field, or in teams that don't generate much energy, then he can need a little bit, like 30, 40, or 50% in order to get his burst back on cooldown. So test out what works for you depending on your team. These are just some general ranges that I hope can help. Now with that out of the way, for the stats you're looking for to maximize his damage, crit rate and crit damage are going to be the standard go-to options that will maximize all of your kit. Right after that, attack percent is also very valuable, especially until you have around 2,500 effective attack to maximize Durin's passive. While it's not mandatory to hit 2,500 no matter what, like crit is generally still a bit more valuable, it is very useful to get that amount when you factor in all of your team's buffs and kind of look at your Durin stats when he is buffed and factor all of that in, and just in general, it's a solid substat. Lastly, if you're triggering reactions on your Durin himself, then Elemental Mastery can be a viable substat as well. As far as its exact value is concerned, this is something I'll get into as we get into the main stats right now. In fact, on your Durin, as far as main stats are concerned, the general go-to build will be going for an attack sands, a crit rate or crit damage circlet, and a pyro damage bonus or attack percent goblet. An attack sands is very straightforward, and so is a crit circlet, and as for your goblet, pyro damage bonus will be the standard, that's always good, but an attack percent goblet can perform very similarly, so you can choose based on your substats. I'd also say to factor in the buffs that your team gives you, as if you have a ton of attack buffers, either to your entire team as your Durin's off field, or even more so if your Durin is on field inside of say Bennett's circle, then a pyro damage bonus goblet can be a bit better. But if you don't have a ton of attack buffs, attack percent can be about as good as pyro damage, or potentially slightly better if you're really low on attack, meaning that they're both really good options that are similar in strength, so you can choose based on your team, the buffs you're getting, and crucially, your substats as well. Now outside of that, regarding Elemental Mastery, this is a main stat option that can be viable in certain reaction-based teams. Firstly, if you're building Durin's damage around a transformative reaction, most notably Burgeon, then he will go for Elemental Mastery on all of his pieces, and he will be played in order to maximize that damage. Now, if you are playing a Vaporize or Melt Durin in the dark mode, and you're wondering whether Elemental Mastery on your sands is viable, well, the answer is going to be yes, but do note that Elemental Mastery loses out on a bit of value because of the fact that Durin in dark mode already gets a lot of reaction damage bonus, in fact 70% in dark mode if you have the Hexerei resonance, and because of the way the reaction damage formula works, it does make Elemental Mastery lose out on a bit of value, but it can still be viable. In fact, while attack percent would generally be better as your main stat, so it's the standard option, if once again you have a lot of attack buffs on your team and are very saturated in how much attack you have, then Elemental Mastery on your sands becomes a more competitive option. For those reasons, EM sands can be viable as well, although generally an attack sands will be the standard and better option. But yeah, main stat wise, it really does depend. There's a lot you can do. Technically, if you have really no energy recharge and need it in a team, an ER sands can be viable too, but the standard option is pyro or attack and crit, but there are cases where full EM or an EM sands can work as well. Alright, now next up for the best weapons on Durin, here's what you need to know. Firstly, Durin's signature weapon will naturally be his best in slot, although it's not as far ahead as you might think. In fact, it is a solid weapon because it gives Durin 33% crit rate as well as 16% crit damage to his burst through its effect, on top of also increasing his attack by 20% and other nearby active party members by 16% as his burst hits enemies. On top of that, when the Hexerei resonance effect is active, so when you're running him with another Hexerei unit, which you often will be doing, these attack buffs will be increased by 75% for a total of 35% attack to him and 28% to other active party members. Because of all of this, it is naturally his best in slot overall, but gains a lot of value, 1, if you have the Hexerei resonance active, and 2, when played as a support or sub DPS, where another attack scaling character will be on field doing a big chunk of your team's damage. Now, just as far as personal damage is concerned, there are weapons that can be very similar in strength, like only 10 or so % behind, making it not a mandatory weapon, especially if you play them like as an on-field DPS where the attack buff is not relevant, but as a support, which I'd say is his most common playstyle, then the extra attack buff to your on-field carry is also going to be appreciated. With that said, it's not the most insane signature weapon and not as big of an increase as some recent weapons we've been getting, and so you should use it if you have it and want to get it. With that said, there are a ton of other 5-star stat sticks that can be a great option for Durin. Almost any that you have that gives you crit, notably weapons like Mist-Splitter or Jade Cutter, can be great choices on Durin. Other options like Haran, Absolution, Azurlight, or Lo-Fi can all be pretty solid as well. Lastly, while Uraku Misagiri and Splendor do give you a lot of crit damage, the effects don't do much for Durin, which make them worse than the other 5 stars, but still okay just for the stats, just less recommended and more comparable to some of his 4-star options. Also, before getting to the 4 stars, I wanted to mention Freedom Sworn as a potentially really strong supportive option for Durin. Now, while it gives you a ton of elemental mastery, which is more relevant if you're triggering reactions on Durin, the effect that will increase his damage and also buff all of your party members' normal charge and plunge attack damage on top of their attack makes it a solid option for a supportive playstyle Durin, as it will buff his own attack and damage while also increasing whatever other DPS you're running, provided they can make use of these stats that he gives them. As far as the support goes though, I'd say that Freedom Sworn is the second best team buffing weapon outside of his signature, and one that I think will be underrated for Durin, so a recommended supportive weapon if you have it available, it's not on someone else. So yeah, not the best for Durin's personal damage, but a great choice if you're supporting, most notably an attack scaling carry, and you have this weapon lying around. I'd say that your best 5 stars overall will be obviously his signature weapon, and then Mist Splitter and Jade Cutter, as well as Freedom Sworn if you can make use of the supportive effects, but basically any of the stat sticks are good. Now outside of that, there are a ton of 4-star options you can use as well. Wolf Fang is a battle pass option that gives you some skill and burst damage, as well as a lot of crit rate. Now while it doesn't have a 100% uptime, it's more than enough to make it a solid option, being comparable to your free-to-play choices at R1, sometimes slightly worse, especially without attack buffs, but better with refinement, especially if you can get it all the way to R5, although yeah, overall it's just a solid choice. Outside of that, Finale of the Deep is a great free-to-play option, a Fontanian craftable, that gives you an absolute ton of attack if you can clear the bond of life that it will give you. While this weapon is great, it does require you having a healer that can get rid of this bond of life, so it won't work in every team, but if it does, it will oftentimes be your best in slot free-to-play option and a great 4-star stat stick overall. Outside of Finale, another great attack stat stick is the Lion's Roar in teams where enemies will be affected by Pyro or Electro, which is the case in a lot of Durin's teams, so Lion's Roar can be great for attack and similar to the other 4-star options. Another one I wanted to mention is actually going to be the Moonweaver's Dawn, which you get 1 copy of for free by exploring nod-krai, and while you can make use of the second part of the effect, because Durin's burst costs 70 energy, the burst damage it gives you, provided with the high base attack and attack stat line, makes it a solid 4-star overall. It is a great free-to-play choice even at R1, and if you get other copies, it obviously becomes a bit better. Now, all of the 4-star weapons I mentioned are pretty good, with the exact value varying based on refinement and the exact team composition, as you will see in the weapon ranking coming up. Before we get there though, I wanted to mention that if you are playing Durin as a Burgeon carry from off-field, then an EM stat stick can work, like any of the generic ones, with Freedom Sworn still being the best, but 4-star options like Zyphos or Iron Sting are great as well. Keep in mind that if you're playing Durin with other reactions like Vaporize or Melt, while EM becomes more viable, it still won't be as good as the crit or attack stat sticks for the reasons we covered in the previous section. Alright, now with that said, I'm gonna put 2 weapon rankings on screen now to help give you guys a general idea of what to expect with each weapon. Now, some important disclaimers are as follows. Firstly, the exact ranking of every weapon varies heavily based on your team, substats, rotations, and reactions you're triggering, so each weapon's exact performance will vary, so use this only to get a general idea and not an exact one. The weapon ranking on the left is for a white mode Durin off-field, assuming an overload team, but the weapons that are good here should be good in general, and on the right is a dark Durin weapon ranking. Here it was calced assuming a melt team, but for Vaporize it should be very similar as they want the same stats. So yeah, 1 dark mode and 1 white mode, but obviously the exact percentages of everything can vary depending on the situation. Additionally, weapons that give you buffs, most notably Durin's signature weapon, and also Freedom Sworn, which isn't actually on here because it's not great for Durin's personal damage, but is actually a really strong supportive weapon if you have an attack scaling character that does normal, charge, or plunge attacks in the team as well, can be better options in that supportive role. So while Durin's signature weapon is good for him, it will also increase your team's overall damage, and so will a weapon like Freedom Sworn. Obviously, other weapons that aren't in the ranking can work as well, but here you get a rough idea of how good each of the generic like crit stat sticks and attack weapons can perform for Durin. Lastly, I wanted to give a huge thanks to MeowTews for the weapon rankings you're seeing today and the math behind them. A link to all of her stuff will be included in the description, so once again, big shout out and thanks to her. Alright, now moving on, for Durin's Constellations, here's what you need to know. Firstly, Durin is a character who's very strong at C0, so it's not like any are needed, but he does have some good ones that are worth covering. Firstly, for Durin's first constellation, this is one that has a very long wall of text, effectively giving you 2 effects, one depending on which mode you are in after you use your burst. Firstly, after bursting inside of white mode, all of your other party members will gain 20 stacks of something called Cycle of Enlightenment, which will buff a hit of their damage when they are on field, provided they do either normal, charge, plunge attacks, elemental skill, or elemental burst damage. When this is the case, one of these stacks will be consumed, and Durin will increase its damage based on his attack in a way that is similar to Shenhe's Icy Quills. And this will effectively just be a nice buff to 20 hits of damage for your active on-field DPS character. With that said, because everyone in your party does get some stacks, you can also buff a few hits of other sub DPSs you might swap into, like for example Fischl, but it only takes effect when they're on field, so it will mostly buff your DPS, but overall it's just an extra amount of damage that you will buff your team with, similarly to other characters with quill-like effects. Now, instead of Durin's dark mode, instead of giving you a supportive buff to your team, he will instead gain 20 of these enlightenment stacks himself, where Durin will consume 2 of them whenever his burst deals damage in order to increase it by an even bigger amount of his attack. This will effectively buff 10 of his elemental burst hits and will just be a solid increase in his personal damage inside of the dark mode. And while it only buffs 10 hits, it has more than double the attack scaling than the supportive mode does, which makes his C1 good for both playstyles. Next up, for Durin's second constellation, this is one that will give all party members a 50% damage bonus to pyro and also any other element involved in a reaction that is triggered after Durin uses his burst. In this case, this applies to literally every pyro reaction, including vaporize and melt, making it a universal buff that will increase all of your party members' damage, Durin included. For those reasons, this is a very good second constellation and a great early stopping point if you're someone who likes vertical investment. 50% elemental damage bonus to Durin and all other party members is a great universal buff. Next up, Durin's C3 and 5 increases talent levels, with C3 being better for his damage as it increases his burst level, so it's better overall, and C5, while it doesn't give you a lot of damage, it will give you a bit more energy generation because that does scale with your talent level, but it's not the biggest deal. For Durin's C4, this is one that will increase his burst damage by 40% and then also give him a 30% chance to not consume the cycle of enlightenment stacks that he gets from his first constellation, which basically just means you'll have a bit more stacks on average. This constellation is decent and will make your average stack count go from 20 to 28, although the exact value will vary because it will depend on your luck. Lastly, for Durin's C6, this is one that will give him a big increase in damage, allowing his burst to ignore 30% of opponent's defense. On top of just that though, inside of white mode, he will also gain Death Shred from his burst that will decrease the opponent's defense by 30%, which will greatly increase your other party members' damage as well as his. On the other hand, inside of dark mode, his damage will ignore an additional 40% of opponent's defense, which makes it a strong C6 overall. Durin's constellations in general are quite flexible because they benefit both of his playstyles, and because Durin's white mode is so flexible and he is such a versatile support, getting these buffs to so many different teams definitely make them some flexible and solid constellations overall. But again, I want to include a reminder that they are not needed and he's very strong even at C0, so do keep that in mind. C2 is a great early stopping point though, and I will say that overall his constellations are quite good. And lastly, if you're wondering which is better between Durin's signature weapon and his first constellation, the exact answer will depend on the team you're running and your playstyle. With that said, Durin's first constellation will typically be a similar or slightly bigger increase in damage as one that works in every single team. Durin's signature weapon, while it is always good for him, will have its exact value vary based on if you have another Hexerei unit in your team, and also varying based on his different playstyle. With that said, Durin's first constellation is generally going to be a bit better as an increase in damage, and also one that is very consistent. I do want to mention though that if you don't have a great weapon option, and also if you want a weapon that you can use on your account as just a crit stat stick, then his signature can have a bit more value for you. But generally, to answer the question of C1 versus R1, while it can depend on your weapon and stuff, the answer will usually be C1. Alright, now with all that out of the way, let's talk about Durin's best teams. Now firstly, to talk a bit about his synergies, let's start with the Hexerei characters and the new Hexerei resonance. As I mentioned earlier, thanks to the new Hexerei buffs to certain characters, if you do a very short quest for both Durin and whichever other Hexerei character you run in your party, the resonance will be active and you will gain some buffs to these characters. Now, while I want to clarify that Durin doesn't need a Hexerei unit for all of his teams, because as a standalone unit, especially as a support with 20% res shred and good off-field pyro application and damage, Durin will fit in so many different teams as a standalone unit. With that said, a lot of his best teams, a decent chunk of them, will feature another Hexerei unit, namely either the DPSs where Durin is an excellent support, or the supports that are great units on their own, but now with Durin and the Hexerei buffs become much better. A great example of this is Fischl, who will be present in the vast majority of Durin overload teams as a support who's great on her own, but thanks to the Hexerei buffs will now also give your team a big amount of attack percent and potentially elemental mastery if you're electrocharging, while also enabling Durin to get even more res shred and potentially having some additional Hexerei synergies with his signature weapon and maybe future characters or something like that. As of right now though, the Hexerei resonance basically just creates some strong pairings like Durin and Fischl in many teams, or Durin and Albedo as just a strong and newly buffed support, while also benefiting Durin himself, making a lot of his best teams feature another Hexerei unit, whereas there are still a lot of other teams that don't require one. Now, keep in mind that you do get to choose a free Hexerei unit thanks to the new kind of witch quest thing, where you can choose either Fischl, Sucrose, or Razor, which is appreciated when it comes to getting a character you don't have or increasing their constellation. population level. Now with that covered, let's talk about Durin's actual team archetypes, where you can play him, and give you guys some example teams as well. So firstly, a very popular team for Durin is going to be overload teams. These teams are going to comprise of Durin, an Electro support, which is almost always going to be Fischl, and then flex options, although the next support is going to be either Chevris as the premier overload support, who's excellent both at C0 and even better at C6, or Bennett if you don't have her available. Once you have that, the last slot can be quite literally almost any Pyro or Electro DPS. Any of the Electro carries you can think of that can be played in a overload team can be used here, and the same can be said about any of the Pyro carries that can be played as well. So I'll save my breath of naming every single one of them, but for those of you who want to play any Pyro carry, right? I'm using Arlecchino as an example here. Well, you can slot them into a very simple overload Durin team, and he will be an excellent off-field Pyro applier, who also deals good damage. Now, for a bit more information, firstly, in a Veresa team, while Fischl still works, Yansan can work as well, and a constellated Yansan can potentially be better, so I did want to mention that. And also, if you don't have Chevris, feel free to use Bennett as a viable alternative. Outside of that, for some specific synergies I wanted to mention, firstly, the Hexerei carries here that can be played in an overload team, so namely Klee and Razor, can really appreciate having Durin in their team and can be played in the carry slot of the team I showed you guys earlier, slotting Klee into the Chevris Fischl Durin team, or Razor into a similar team but with a C6 Bennett instead of Chevris to give him some Pyro normal attacks on top of his Electro for a ton of reactions. Outside of that, Sethos can also be played in an overload team, but also one that has both burning and overload, running a Dendro character as well. And Linny's just here because I feel like he doesn't get a lot of love, so I wanted to mention him as one of the viable Pyro carries, but I could say the same about characters like Yoimiya, Yanfei, Arlecchino, Hu Tao, or literally any, and the same can be said with the Electros as well. For example, characters like Razor, Clorind, Veresa, Raiden, Sino, Sethos, Kaching, or just anyone who could be on field like a Catalyst character, all can work as an on-field option in these overload teams. It really is pretty universal. So yeah, overload Durin teams are great, as Durin is not only a support, but also an off-field kind of carry or sub-DPS in these teams as well. Moving on, you can play him with a Nemo carry, so he works really well with the newly buffed Venti, getting the Hexerei Resonance, and yeah, Venti can be a carry now. He also works with other Nemo carries like Shao or Wanderer, or virtually any single Nemo carry as a form of off-field Pyro app, and also a Nemo Res Shred. He also works well in a Chaska team, which have performed surprisingly well. Honestly, I really do like teams like this for Chaska, running Durin, and then there's a lot of other options. Durin Fischl with a flex slot works. There's a double Electro team with Fischl and Yansan. You can even run a Hydro character here like Mona, other Electros like Inefa, or Cryos like Sitlali, or even a Scoffy alongside Mona. Outside of that, Durin works well as the Pyro applier in a Kniech team. Once again, as with everyone else, the exact slots are flexible, but Durin works with Albedo for the Hexerei Resonance, but you don't need it, and you can also run Emily or just any flex slot you have available, with Emily and Albedo being my favorites. And then the last slot should be a buffer like Yansan or Bennett. Durin is a great Pyro option for a Kniech team, and outside of that, you can also run him alongside Geo carries like Navia, Ito, Noel, or others. Once again, he's just a generic Pyro off-fielder here. Ito teams will oftentimes have a triple Geo core with Goro and another Geo such as Albedo, and Navia teams run one other Geo like Albedo if you have him, but Shilonin or Chiori can work too. The last slot is going to be flex option, with Bennett being your go-to buffer. Durin also works in a Flint's team as a viable last slot alongside your best Electro and Hydro. Do note that in this team you can run Ino Inefa, but you can also replace Ino with a Mona, who can just barely give you enough Hydro application if played properly and with enough energy recharge to help enable your reactions. In a team like this, you should be able to get lunar charges for your Flins and also some vaporizes and overloads for your Durin as well. Do note that while if you don't have Inefa, you can use Fischl, you will not have a healer this way, so you'll have to run a healer in one slot or prototype Amber on someone if you have a Catalyst. All of this is covered more in my Flynn's guide, but yeah, Durin works here as a flex option. You can also play Durin as an off-field Pyro in a Mualani team, and this one is quite flexible. You could do Albedo Durin to get Albedo's new buffs for Mualani, or you could do Mona, especially with Constellations, and Durin to give her buffs. You can also run Sucrose to get her buffs, and the last slot is flexible. Shilonin works as a form of Res Shred, as he will be in dark mode and can't shred Hydro resistance anyways, while also being a healer if you need a panic button. Through the early math that has been done, it does seem like Mualani's kind of quote-unquote best team is going to look like Mualani, Mona, Sucrose, and then a Pyro option, with Mawika being the strongest here because you already have the Witch Resonance from Sucrose and Mona, but your only healer here is like a prototype Amber Mona, and so if you want to change that up or want to run Durin, you can do Durin Mona and then Shilonin as your healer, or this team that I'm showing you. There's really a lot of flex options. Maybe I'm covering this too much, but yeah, Durin works here as off-field Pyro, and he'll enable the Hexerei Resonance for another support like Albedo or Mona. Durin also works with on-field Hydros, like most notably Neuvillette. You can run Neuvillette in a standard carry team with Durin as a great off-field option, who can be in dark mode vaporizing. I also want to mention that in the teams where I didn't mention dark or white mode, he's going to be in white mode. Like all of these other teams, teams, he's typically just in white mode and you don't have to worry too much about it. In a Neuvillette team, he's obviously paired with flex options, whatever the best supports are for your Neuvillette, and he can vaporize. A great team I really enjoyed as well is Burgeon in a Neuvillette team, most notably in AoE, if you have Neuvillette and Lauma available. With that said, Durin can also be played in generic Burgeon teams, running him with a fast Hydro Plier and whatever your best Dendro option is. Obviously, Llama works amazing, but if you don't have her, a generic Dendro slot can work, and the last slot is flexible. I just use Fischl for great damage and the Hexerei Resonance. Do note though that if you are playing a Burgeon team like the Neuvillette one or this one here, your Durin actually wants to be in white mode in order to get the Res Red, and he should be built on full Elemental Mastery. In the other Neuvillette teams, if you're wondering, he will be in dark mode, but yeah, in Burgeon, you should put him on white mode. Outside of that, other Hydro Appliers, generic on-fielders can work for Durin, with Mona being the most notable and best synergy, who got a lot of buffs with the Hexerei Resonance, being able to extend her Omen's duration, increase a lot of your damage, be played as an on-fielder but also an off-fielder, just do 4 normal attacks before swapping, and she's one who gets notably better with her new C1, C2, and then even C4. Outside of that, for some main DPS Durin teams where you're actually playing him on field, these will feature C6 Bennett to make his normal and charge attacks pyro. You can play Overvape with Farina, allowing you to run the Marechaussee Hunter set, and in my testing, I got a good uptime on my vaporizes, but sometimes it messed up, so if you want faster Hydro, you can do that, and you can even run Singcho here as a 4-star option who works great. You can also run Durin as a DPS in an Overload team where he can be an off-field DPS, like that's normally what's going to happen when paired with another carry, but if you want to on-field him, you can run Bennett here, and this works as well. And Durin will obviously be on white mode in this team. Outside of that, you can run Durin alongside Farina and Mona, and use Mona to apply some extra Hydro, and Durin in dark mode to do all of the damage. Outside of that, Durin can also be played in melt teams, although note that in these teams, who's melting will depend on which form your Durin's in, and also how fast your Cryo and Pyro application is. As a DPS, dark mode Durin, you can run a fast Cryo applier and enable your Durin in his dark mode to get melts on his burst and increase his personal damage that way, whereas Durin can also be played in the white mode in these teams, and while he won't offer you Cryo Res Shred, so he won't be as insane as a support, he still will give you good and faster Pyro application with good uptime and good damage that will enable another crowd character you're running to get melts themselves, so he can be a viable option in both forms. Also, while I still have some Yehoda testing to do as she just came out, Durin is a viable support in her teams as well, where provided you have Ascended Gleam, when paired with a support like Inefa or Ino, Yehoda can get some elemental infused damage, and Durin paired with potentially another Hexerei unit can be nice supports and damage dealers there. And so yeah, as you can see, Durin has a ton of different teams where he works, a ton of different playstyles, and someone who I think is going to be most popular as a white mode off-field burst support and sub DPS, but also a powerful dark mode off-field damage dealer as well. Someone who has great pyro application and who's honestly usable in so many different teams as a great off-field pyro option. I'm very happy with his versatility and the flexibility in his teams. Regarding a showcase, I did a full video showing him off previously, so if you want to see more teams in action, do check that out, but I've made sure to include a bunch of different footage in this video as well for my C0 Durin on the live server. With that said, I'm not going to include another extra showcase section because this video is already getting really long and I did another video on it in case you are interested. With that said, thank you for your patience on this guide. I'm sorry it took longer than usual. My PC genuinely has been frustrating to work with. It's been shutting off randomly a lot, so I've been in the process of upgrading it, and hopefully for Columbina all is sorted and I can get you guys a guide out earlier with the same level of information. As always, thanks so much for watching. Be sure to check the pinned comment in case anything is new, because Durin is a new character, so things might change and who knows what the future will bring us. Let me know what you want to see next, as I do plan on making some new guides and reviews. Let me know which characters you want to see, and I also want to do an account review of my account after kind of 5 years of playing Genshin Impact. If that's something you're interested in, do let me know, and I'm gonna stop yapping there. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.